In this video I'm detailing a homemade plastisol injector that I made. You can see the basic components here. I have a plunger arm that goes into a can or a cylinder with a nozzle at the end. It's rather simple. Let me show you how I've done it. So the key ingredient is all-purpose silicone caulk. This is the cheapest stuff they have at Walmart. It's important you get the cheap stuff, the stuff that sets up with the vinegar smell. Otherwise, it's not going to work right. So that's just about all I spent on this was $4.50. So I'll show you some of the other things. I'm using a plunger handle, literally an extra handle I had from a toilet bowl plunger. I think any sort of broom handle or stick or pipe or there'd be a whole plethora of things you could use. Just basically anything rigid as the syringe handle on the injector. And to contain the plastic for a cylinder, I just used a stainless steel water container. This is another one, not the one I actually used, but just to give you an example of something that the same general diameter and shape. And that stainless steel's not so thick, but it's good enough for what we're doing. And the good thing is it won't rust. I think there's a whole number of containers you could probably use, like old paint cans or shaving cream cans, or maybe other things like pipes, whatever, but you'll just have to use your imagination and what fits your budget. So I also had some old connectors lying around that I could have used. I could have just used half-inch pipe, or if I had quarter-inch pipe that would work, or there's a half-inch to a quarter-inch thread change, or another pipe adapter. Just it's a whole lot of things, but you can also probably just use straight silicone, but what you need is some kind of nozzle tip. So another ingredient to this would be just electrical tape, and that's just to insulate, to keep the plastic from cooling. I also use some high temp epoxy, just kind of an optional thing, but it kind of helped at least with the way I work. So at any rate, I'll go detail some of the construction steps that it took to build this, and we'll see a little better on what it takes to make one of these things, which really isn't that much, just some tinkering. Now I'm showing the nozzle, which I formed a custom fit using high temperature epoxy putty. Regular epoxy won't work. And you can see there I'm ejecting the silicone caulk to make a disc at the bottom of the cylinder. I'm using about half the tube for that. And here's what I'm replacing. I got this for about $30 on Amazon, and although it works okay for small molds, the aluminum is one big heat sink, so it cools off the plastic quickly. So in the end, it fits about a fifth of a cup of plastic. You can only really use less than a sixth of a cup, which effectively means it only works for the smallest molds. So you could pay 40 or more for a bigger injector. For a good one, probably more like 50 or 60, but I think that this is where a homemade injector might make some sense for you, at least if you're on a tight budget, or if you don't mind tinkering around a bit just for the fun of it. You can see I use a cutoff wheel there, a grinder. I also use a drill. Those are about the two special tools I used. There's the one thing I bought that's maybe not too common. I got that at Lowe's. And again, you don't necessarily need that, but I use this for my nozzle fitting, and I'll put the details, exactly what the part is, in the description. And there's the actual can that I used as the cylinder to contain the plastisol. And basically, it's pretty simple. I just cut off one end and then use the other end for the injector piece, and by drilling a hole. So the concept's pretty simple, and you could use a whole number of different ingredients to make this work. I just used basically what I found first when I decided to set up to do this project. And probably the magic ingredient here is the silicone caulking, because that's what makes the gaskets and the plunger piece, and that's what makes everything solid enough that it will pump the plastic through. I'm just kind of eyeballing the pieces before I put this together. I didn't plan too closely, but I knew I could eyeball it well enough to realize I'd come out with something that would probably work when I was done. So now I'm cutting off one end of the can. In this case, of course, you could use a whole lot of things to cut this steel. It's not too hard, but even though it's a lot thinner than the aluminum that you would buy in a store-bought mold, because it's steel instead of aluminum, it's still rather strong. And one tricky thing though is you end up with some sharp edges, so be sure to smooth them down once you cut this. I'm using a bench grinder. I end up sanding it more. But now I'm starting with the hole for the nozzle. So I start with a small drill bit, and I use a bigger one, and then I work my way up to a 1/4 inch drill bit, which is what I need to push the nozzle through. So again, make sure you cover up that end there so you don't get cut. And I used electrical tape. I ended up using electrical tape around the whole thing, which insulates it nicely. I can hold it with hot plastisol without gloves, and I don't get burnt. And it doesn't have the heat sink effects that all the aluminum does in the store-bought injector. So now I'm cutting a disc out of some cardboard. This is just to help shape the silicone disc that's going to be at the bottom. That's going to help keep everything airtight, and then also hold the injector nozzle into place. I end up using about half the silicone tube on the bottom half and half on the top half. And the trick with this silicone is to use a minimal amount of water. You want to add just enough water to allow it to set, which I think for the whole tube of 10 ounces of silicone caulk, I used about a teaspoon of water. So it's really not a lot, but it's important you mix it in well, and then that water will permeate through, and it forms acetic acid that sets the plastic, and it gives off a strong smell, but it doesn't really harm anything. So you can see there's my first attempt at a custom nozzle, the epoxy. It didn't work very well. And you can see there I used some washers just to hold the silicone in the plunger piece in place, and then a wood disc at the end of that with a pipe holder. So that's it. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.